This is what I did for Holmes is Where the Heart Is, February 2026. As part of the Holmes is Where the Heart Is BookTube event in February, I thought I would look into the Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. Actually, one of the tasks of this year was to look at pastiches of Sherlock Holmes, which I managed to do for last year's Holmes is Where the Heart Is. I can never seem to get my timings right with these monthly BookTube events. After all, I'm recording this in March. One of the problems with these BookTube events is that you plan a project, you do a lot of reading about a project, and by the time you look up for air, it's suddenly close to the end of the month, and you kind of have to rush to get your video out. Yes, and it wasn't helped in this case by discovering Anna Catherine Green and her book The Leavenworth Case, which was written in 1879, almost a full decade before the Sherlock Holmes stories came out. The Leavenworth Case is a fully complete detective novel. It's a bit Victorian in its scope, but yeah, it's a fully formed detective novel, and it's highly recommended. And I can't help feeling that we might be in a Joseph Swan, Thomas Edison situation here. Anna Catherine Green is our Joseph Swan, creating a detective novel, and less than a decade later, Arthur Conan Doyle, who is our Edison in this analogy, comes along and remakes the detective novel in his own image and takes up all the oxygen. I've based this selection of Rivals of Sherlock Holmes on a series of books edited by Hugh Carlton Greene. He was a brother of Graham Greene and had been, during the 1960s, the Director General of the BBC. In 1970, he edited a volume which was called The Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. It was followed by 3 more volumes up until 1976. It also inspired a television series made with some of the stories from the earlier books. There are over 30 writers and writing teams featured in the 4 volumes of these Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, and I rather unscientifically picked the 10 authors and writing teams who appear more than once in the volumes. I also picked another couple who caught my eye for various reasons, bringing up the number to 12. Having said that, it's worth mentioning a name that isn't in the volumes of the Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, but perhaps ought to be. A bit of historical background. In 1894, in the story The Final Problem, Conan Doyle kills off Sherlock Holmes at the Reichenbach Falls, and didn't bring him back until 1902. There's an 8-year hiatus where there were no new Sherlock Holmes stories. And magazines, especially The Strand, were looking for people to fill that Sherlock Holmes-shaped gap. But at the same time, there were people who were reacting to Sherlock Holmes and thinking, well, just as the devil has better tunes, sometimes the criminals are more interesting than the detectives. So as well as getting Rivals of Sherlock Holmes, we also get criminals who are rivals of detectives in a slightly different way. As I said, one of the people missing from Hugh Carlton Greene's collection of short stories are the stories about A.J. Raffles, the amateur cracksman, a gentleman thief created by E.W. Hornung. Why is he important? Because he married Constance Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle's sister. Arthur Conan Doyle and E.W. Hornung got on very well. After E.W. Hornung's relatively early death in 1921, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote of him that he was a Dr. Johnson without the education but with a finer wit. We know of one other piece of advice that Arthur Conan Doyle gave to E.W. Hornung, and that was not to make a hero of a criminal, which of course is what E.W. Hornung did in creating A.J. Raffles. This didn't particularly cause a split with his brother-in-law, but while Arthur Conan Doyle enjoyed the literary merits of Raffles, he didn't approve of the morality. Let's return to Hugh Carlton Greene's selection of Rivals of Sherlock Holmes and talk about the rather wonderfully named Rodrigues Ottolengui. He was a dentist who was something of an innovator, being an early pioneer of X-ray treatment. He also wrote a rather detailed treatise on fillings. For a long time he edited a dental magazine in the United States, which is where he's from. In 1892 he published his novel An Artist in Crime, a first of 4 books to feature his detective Jack Barnes. An Artist in Crime I found was a very readable detective novel, and Jack Barnes is an intelligent, thoughtful detective. We're not quite in the days of fair play yet, so the detective is usually several steps in front of us. I was slightly more fascinated when I moved on to his next book from 1894. This is A Conflict of Evidence. And what fascinated me about this is that it is a fully formed country house murder novel. All the tropes, all the things you would expect from a country house murder are here in 1894, 20 or even 30 years before they appear as the epitome of the English crime novel. The slight problem I do have with the work of Rodrigues Ottolengui is that he does rely an awful lot on coincidence. In An Artist in Crime, he has the detective overhearing a somewhat arrogant artist who thinks the detective might be overhearing him. In A Conflict of Evidence, a pivotal character appears out of nowhere just in order to be the pivotal character. It doesn't quite sit right, but other than that, they are very satisfying novels. We'll move on to the first of our Hugh Carlton Green authors, and that is Catherine Louisa Pirkis, writing as C.L. Pirkis, and her book, The Adventures of Loveday Brooke, Lady Detective, from 1894. C.L. Pirkis had written 14 novels from about 1877 onwards, and Loveday Brooke does seem to be her last fictional work. Thereafter, she's a campaigner and writes non-fiction. One of her major achievements in the 20th century was to set up the National Canine Defence League, which is nowadays known as the charity The Dogs Trust. This small collection of 7 detective stories featuring Loveday Brooke were favourably compared at the time to Sherlock Holmes. I don't think these days we would quite go that far, but they're certainly extremely good and really leave you wanting more. I could easily have read 20 of these short stories. They are very entertaining, and Loveday Brooke is a practical, observant detective. She's not glamorous, and she is around about 30, so she's not some kind of coquette who can charm her way into things. She is just highly practical and sensible. She works for a detective agency, kind of as an agent, as I believe they would be called at the time. But in those sort of Sherlock Holmes starved days, people were desperate for everything, and these are a very good choice. And it's a pity that we don't get more. There's a rather backward compliment to Loveday Brooke that was published in a Scottish newspaper. It went along the lines of, "We are afraid that Miss Brooke is so talented at catching criminals that she will never quite catch a husband." I'm not sure that Loveday Brooke would be complimented by that particular assertion. Our next author is Arthur Morrison, and he has a somewhat special place in writers of the Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. His detective character Martin Hewitt appeared in 1894 in the Strand magazine. He was commissioned as the Strand magazine's replacement for the Sherlock Holmes stories. Martin Hewitt is a professional investigator, but he's very much not like Sherlock Holmes, rather deliberately in fact. He's sort of slightly well-padded, older, less dynamic than Sherlock Holmes, and a lot more practical and logical than Sherlock Holmes. We're not really going to be dealing with fascinating heights of deduction from Martin Hewitt. But all the same, these stories were very popular and ran in the Strand magazine for quite a long time. In 1897, Arthur Morrison branched away from his Martin Hewitt stories to produce a small volume of short stories featuring Horace Dorrington. These are called the Dorrington Deed Box. Horace Dorrington is a rogue and a scoundrel, as well as being a private investigator. He's likely to rip off most people, especially if they are a bit too rich and a bit too criminal. Our next rival of Sherlock Holmes, Grant Allen's first proper go at a kind of detective fiction was The African Millionaire, or Stories from the Illustrious Life of Colonel Clay. Colonel Clay is a confidence trickster, a master of disguise, and in episodes throughout this novel spends his time stealing money from an African millionaire. The African millionaire is a little bit ambivalent about all of this. He is fully aware that he didn't become a millionaire simply by being a nice guy and making sharp deals. He trod on a lot of toes and punched in a lot of faces to get where he was. And he has a creeping admiration for the Colonel Clay, who keeps besting him. Grant Allen had an interesting life. He was born in Canada, he educated in Britain. He went to Jamaica to teach at an early all-black university before returning to England to write. He was principally a scientist and wrote on scientific matters, especially evolution and psychology. In 1895, he appears to have written a rather wonderful-looking science fiction novel called British Barbarians, all about a mysterious man who goes into an English village and starts studying the people as if he is on an anthropological mission amongst the most ignorant of savages. Grant Allen also created a couple of female detectives. We have Miss Cayley's Adventures in 1899 and Hilda Wade in 1900. When he was writing Hilda Wade, Grant Allen was very sick. He was suffering from liver cancer, and he did not have long to live. In fact, he died in 1899 before Hilda Wade was published. Hilda Wade was being serialised in the Strand magazine, and he was very worried that he wouldn't be able to finish it. At the time, he was living in Hindhead, and his near neighbour was a certain Arthur Conan Doyle. And Grant Allen asked his friend if he would be able to finish the last few chapters so that they could be published in the Strand. And Arthur Conan Doyle was more than happy to do so. So a couple of years before he wrote The Hounds of the Baskervilles, Arthur Conan Doyle was dipping his toe back into detective fiction. And you can bet Hilda Wade is on my TBR. Our next author is Guy Boothby, an Australian author whose dates are 1867 to 1905. Obviously he died young, but in a writing career of just over 10 years, he managed to push out 50 novels. His chief works concern a certain Dr. Nicola, who is a man interested in the occult, in immortality and in world domination. These aren't really detective novels, but I thought I'd mention them anyway. His contribution to detective novels comes in 1900 with The Prince of Swindlers. This book is chiefly about Simon Khan, a master of disguise, a swindler, and a man out to fleece the rich. Against him is an eccentric detective simply known as Clymo. And of course, what we know about Clymo is that he is in fact Simon Khan in disguise. He has to switch identities to keep ahead of the police. The book is overall very entertaining, but there is a certain amount of, oh yeah, here's another person you've ripped off, Mr. Khan, which isn't quite so amusing after a time. Our next author is M. McDonnell Bodkin. He started life as a barrister, called to the bar in 1879 and serving as a barrister in the Irish county of Connaught. Between 1892 and 1895, he served as an anti-Parnellite nationalist MP in Parliament, only giving up because his practice as a barrister was suffering. In 1907, he went slightly against the Irish nationalists who he had traditionally supported to become a county court judge in Ireland. It was at the time felt that you shouldn't cooperate with the British government and the British state, and an Irish nationalist should not become a county court judge. All the same, it didn't stop his pro-nationalist feelings, and in 1921 he wrote a damning report about the behaviour of the Black and Tans in County Clare. He created his detective Paul Beck in 1897. It was another case of creating a detective who was a more thoughtful, less flashy version of Sherlock Holmes. In fact, in one of the early Paul Beck stories, there are a couple of detectives who are at the house that Paul Beck visits. They have eliminated the impossible and claimed the solution to the case is the improbable. but as it turns out, that they've probably overlooked the simply obvious. They are very clearly supposed to be Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. McDonnell Bodkin created a female detective called Dora Merle in 1900. He continued to write Paul Beck stories and brought Dora Merle and Paul Beck together in a book called The Capture of Paul Beck. This is where they get married. That book was in 1909, and somewhat puzzlingly, in 1911 he wrote a book called The Chip Off the Old Block, where the son of Paul Beck and Dora Merle, Paul Beck Jr., solves crimes while he is at university. He features all of the Beck family in a novel called Pigeon Blood Rubies in 1915. He continued to write Paul Beck and family short stories in various magazines and publications until 1929, when he retired from writing. His final collection of short stories is called the Paul Beck Casebook, which was published in 1929. Our next author is a synonymous author called Clifford Ashdown. It was a pseudonym of the detective writer R. Austin Freedman and John James Pitcairn, who was the medical officer at Holloway Prison. Their character was Romney Pringle. On the face of it, he is a literary agent, but in reality, he is a con man. He's a kind of con man who will take up a criminal scheme, run with it, and then leave pocketing all the money and leaving the original criminal to suffer the consequences of his action. He will also take advantage of foolish gamblers who might leave pieces of important government documentation lying around. For some years, R. Austin Freeman denied writing under the name Clifford Ashdown. He preferred people to think of his solo detective, Dr. Thorndyke. But it was eventually revealed that he was indeed part of the team that wrote the Romney Pringle stories. Our next author is the Baroness Orczy. Muska, or Emma Orczy, was born in Hungary but came to Britain when she was 14. She is best known, of course, for her Scarlet Pimpernel stories, starting in 1903 and going on until 1933. I think it's a grand total of 18 novels and short story collections. She creates two rather interesting detectives. In 1905 she creates The Old Man in the Corner. This is a rather strange man who camps out in an ABC tea shop, playing with bits of string and telling a female journalist how he has solved a whole rash of cases. The thing is that the Old Man in the Corner isn't really interested in justice. He's interested in being right with his solutions of the crime, but he's very aware that his solutions wouldn't really stand up in court, and that he's not particularly interested in seeing the guilty party going to prison. Baroness Orczy wrote 3 volumes of short stories about the Old Man in the Corner, and in the last one it is revealed that he may well be a criminal himself and not wanting his fellow criminals to go to prison. A quick diversion on the ABC tea shop. ABC stands for Aerated Bread Company. This was a company that made aerated bread in the 1860s, and they set up a number of bakeries and attached a number of tea shops. The tea shops did a great deal better than the bakeries and kept going until the 1950s. They are featured in a great number of works. Agatha Christie, Virginia Woolf, Graham Greene, John le Carré all mention the ABC tea rooms. Even Jonathan Harker in Bram Stoker's Dracula pops in for a bun. I think there might be a book list there somewhere. Baroness Orczy's second creation was Lady Molly of Scotland Yard in 1910. This is an aristocratic woman who wheedles her way into a back office in Scotland Yard by being the sort of person who notices only things that women notice, or things only about women. In this time, in the late Victorian, early Edwardian period, women are somewhat invisible unless they're chaining themselves to railings or smashing windows. The Lady Molly stories are narrated by Lady Molly's somewhat gushing assistant, Mary. Yes, a big schoolgirl crush is my general feeling about that. But the stories are very well written. I mean, The woman could write, there's no doubt about that. Our next author is Jacques Futrelle. In spite of the name, he was an American author who created a detective called Professor Augustus SFX Van Dusen. He features in 47 short stories and is often accompanied or aided by a reporter called Hutchinson Hatch. The Professor Van Dusen's stories are all about science and scientific innovation. He calls himself the thinking machine because he is able to think his way out of seemingly impossible problems, including being locked in solitary confinement for a week in a prison and managing to escape all the same. They are entertaining stories and often have a scientific basis for the solution. Jacques Futrelle died on the night of the 7th and 8th of April 1912. He was last seen talking with John Jacob Astor on the deck of the Titanic. He had just forced his wife onto one of the lifeboats. His body was never found. Our next author is Maurice Leblanc, who created Arsène Lupin, a gentleman thief, but unlike A.J. Raffles, not a gentleman addicted to the filthy game of cricket. Arsène Lupin features in 17 novels and 39 novellas. He was immensely popular and still is. Only recently there was a series based on Arsène Lupin, all modernised, but retelling many of the stories. The last story in his first collection of Arsène Lupin's stories is called Sherlock Holmes Arrives Too Late, and features Arsène Lupin coming up against Sherlock Holmes for the first time. This didn't cause Arthur Conan Doyle to sue Maurice Leblanc, but there does seem to have been some kind of communication between them, and in future episodes of Arsène Lupin, if he needed a Sherlock Holmes, a character called Sherlock Sholmes would turn up instead. For our next rival of Sherlock Holmes, we have another writing team, William MacHarg and Edwin Balmer. They were a brother-in-law team. Edwin Balmer was married to William MacHarg's sister. In 1910, they created Luther Trant, who was a detective who specialised in psychological and scientific solutions, often using recently developed forensic techniques and things that look suspiciously like early lie detectors. I did find in reading this, the use of lie detectors was slightly off-putting. They don't have a good reputation these days, so I thought the over-reliance of them rather let the stories down. This wasn't the only collaboration by Edwin Balmer. In 1933, he wrote a novel with Philip Wiley called When Worlds Collide, which was later made into a somewhat blockbuster 1950s science fiction movie. We come to our last rival of Sherlock Holmes, Ernest Bramah's Max Carados, first collected as a book in 1914. Max Carados was a blind detective, and his stories often appeared in the Strand with the same billing as Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories. With Ernest Bramah stories, and certainly the early ones, you often get the feeling that you have come in halfway through the case. It's almost as if you suddenly walk in and there Poirot is summing up everything. Things have already been solved. It's all been resolved. It just needs Max Carados to make a few additional deductions. But he's done an awful lot of research beforehand, and he knows an awful lot more about the case than we do as the reader. This can be a little bit frustrating. Ernest Bramah really started out as an assistant editor and secretary to Jerome K. Jerome before branching out and trying to launch his own magazines, which were not successful. He attempted a science fiction novel in 1907, which was called What Might Have Been. This is a somewhat, shall we say, right-wing look at the world and how terrible the world would be if the socialists got in. It is said that George Orwell gained some inspiration from it when he was writing 1984. In 1900, he created a character called Kai Lung, who was a Chinese storyteller who often got into situations which required fantastical explanations. quite possibly involving dragons. These Kylan stories were at the time very popular, but as Saxe Rohmer's Yellow Peril books featuring Dr. Fu Manchu were on the horizon, perhaps they lost their charm after a while. In creating Max Carados, Ernest Bramah claimed that while not entirely inspired by them, he was very aware of blind people who had achieved a great deal, such as Nicholas Sanderson, who was the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge at one point. This is a role held by both Isaac Newton and Stephen Hawking. He also cites Helen Keller and John Fielding, a Bow Street magistrate and the brother of Henry Fielding, the novelist. So that's my small selection of Sherlock Holmes rivals. There are plenty more in the Rivals of Sherlock Holmes books, and of course plenty more in that Hugh Carlton Greene didn't pick. Goodbye.